Some people measure their swim, bike and run in imperial, so in miles, and some people measure it in metric, in meters and kilometers. Now, I'm a big fan of the metric system, and I really think that a lot of athletes would benefit if you are still working in miles of converting over to the metric system into kilometers. And in this video, I'm going to lay out the case for why I think it would really make your life easier and would just be better for you if you made that switch too. So I'm going to make, I've got a series of points, and I think they will get stronger in terms of convincing how much your life is going to be easier if you were using metric, but I think to build my case, we'll work through them one at a time. So number one is it's the international standard. So in terms of miles, imperial measurements, there's only a couple of countries kind of half using them. We're still sort of using them in the UK. They're still widely used in the US as well. And there might be a couple of other places that use them, but in general, everything else, all the other countries have moved over to metric. So if you watch, say, the Canadian coverage of a marathon, it's all in kilometers, and all of the big bike races happen in kilometers as well because they're all in Europe. I think the Tour of California is really the only one where I see miles used a lot, and you still get the metric conversion in there because the whole of cycling works in metric. And also, the metric is the international scientific standard. It's the SI unit that's been adopted by scientists in all countries. So if you do science, even here in the UK or the US, you will find yourself working in metric because everything works in metric. That's how the entire scientific community uses it. And so we're not going to get rid of metric because it's the world standard, and so that means that either we have two standards, we have both imperial and metric, and we have to do both and constantly convert between them, or we just adopt one and it's clear that metric is going to win. Now, maybe you're thinking, yeah, but I'm a proud British person or a proud American, and this is our measurement system, which isn't really true. Like the imperial system, obviously associated with the British Empire, even if you're using the US customary measurements, it comes from the British imperial system. But the British imperial system really evolved out of a bunch of different countries invading us and giving us their measurements. It wasn't like we invented it all. So I really don't think kind of patriotism is an issue here. But also, like, we inevitably have to use metric anyway. So as I said, all the big cycling races are in metric. Running tracks are 400 meters. So if you want to go run around a running track and do some intervals, you have to do it in metric because running tracks are 400 meters. Also, pools, typically 25 or 50 meters. There are some really old pools in the UK that are like 25 yards. But overwhelmingly, pools are built to like Olympic standards or Olympic distances, which is of course 25 and 50 meters. It also makes it a lot easier because the really most common race distances are all in metric. So if you think about a running race, you're probably doing a 5K or a 10K. And so working in metric really makes this easier. If you're, say, doing a 10K and you want to go under an hour, you know that you need to run 6 minutes a kilometer. You want to do a 50-minute 10K, you need to run 5 minutes a kilometer. You want to do a 45-minute 10K, you need to run 4.5 minutes a kilometer. Really works nicely because that's what the race distance is in. And there's really no point where this swaps around. So if we look at short format triathlon, then it's all again in metric. So it's like the Olympic distance is 1500 meter swim, 40k bike, 10k run. Again, it's all in metric. Now you can go up and we can say, well, what about ultra marathons? Well, there's a bit of a mix because you might get a 50k or a 75k or a 100k ultra marathon. You might also get a 50 mile or a 100 mile ultra marathon, so a bit of a mixed bag there. What about the marathon itself? Well, the marathon itself isn't in any distance, like it's 42 kilometers, but it's not exactly 42, it's like 42.215 or something, and it's 26.2 miles, but again, it's not exactly 26, it's like 26.219 or something. So it doesn't fit, a marathon doesn't fit into either measurement system. I've got a whole video about how we standardized the distance of a marathon. I'll put a link in the description below, but it doesn't fit into either imperial or metric. And then if we look at something like Ironman, again, it doesn't really fit into anything because it's a 2.4 mile or 3.8 kilometer swim. It's a 112 or 180 kilometer bike, and then a marathon, which is a weird distance again. Now it actually works slightly better in metric because in imperial, the total distance of the race ends up being 140.6 and 70.3 for a half. Whereas because 3.8 and 42.2 happen to add together, in metric, the total distance for an Ironman ends up being 226 kilometers or 113 for the half. So that actually works slightly better, but ultimately the way that Ironman came about was they just stuck a bunch of races together, and nobody really planned it as these exact distances in either imperial or metric. So generally when we're racing, we have to work in metric again. So again, you might still hold out and say, no, I don't care if everyone else is using it. This is my system and I want to use it. But I also think that it makes our life way easier. So again, for example, if we're, say, running intervals, well, a kilometer divides really well because it's 1,000 meters in a kilometer. That's not true of miles. Miles, there is 1,760 yards in a mile. So if you want to run half a mile, how many yards is that? I mean, I could do the maths fairly quickly, but I can, without even having to think, I can tell you if I want to run half a kilometer, it's 500 meters. Because it just works really well. Whereas you start having to, especially if you're saying, okay, let's run a quarter of a mile or a quarter of a kilometer, then you're having to, say, divide 1,760 by 4, man, that gets messy really quickly. And then if you want to divide it even further, then you've got like, well, we've got 3 feet in a yard. Whereas with metric, everything is super standardized. So you've got millimeter, 1,000 of those gives you a meter, 1,000 of those gives you a kilometer. And that works across everything. So it works across, say, grams. You're measuring your weight. You've got milligrams, grams, kilograms. It works super good again. And if you're doing something like calculating your BMI, you need to use metric measurements. So your BMI is based on your weight in kilograms and your height in meters. And if you're using a calculator to calculate your BMI, what the calculator is doing behind the scenes is it's taking what you're putting in, converting it into metric if you're not giving it in metric, and then it's doing the calculation because it's based on that. And again, like weight is like the 16 ounces in a pound and 14 pounds in a stone. It's really hard to do maths on that because our number system is based on base 10. And of course, metric is based on base 10 because everything's like 1,000 or 10 in the case. So we look at distance, we've got millimeter, centimeter, decimeter, meter. Works super well across all of those because our number system is based on base 10, whereas imperial, we've got like 3 and 14 and 16 and 1,760. It's pretty confusing. The other gaping hole in imperial measurements is there's no real measurement for power. So if you're a big cyclist, you're probably using a power meter and cycling to power if you can afford one. And there's really no way to do that other than to use metric. Like the watt is a metric measurement. There is an imperial measurement of power and it's horsepower. But the problem is that 200 watts, which is something that you might cycle at if you're working quite hard, or if you're a really good athlete taking it a bit easier, maybe you're cycling about 200 watts, well, that's a quarter of a horse. So really not really a useful measurement if you're thinking, sometimes I will look at races and think, oh, I did 190 watts average there and 200 watts average there. Well, if you're trying to measure that in horsepower, and I'm like, well, it's like 0.24 here and 0.26 here, it's really not going to work. It's just not a usable measurement. So that is my pitch for imperial measurements. It's the international standard, it's not going anywhere, and we have to use it a lot of the time anyway. That's how our swimming pools are, that's how our running tracks are, that's how all of our race distances are. So we end up having to use it anyway. So do we want to use two systems, or do we just want everything to be in the same system? I would say it would be way easier to use it in the same system. And it's way easier to do all the maths, to do all the conversions, to split something down, to divide it. It all works in base 10, which is how our number system works. So as athletes, it makes our lives way easier as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If so, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're interested in triathlon, running, cycling, hit that subscribe button, because that's what my channel is all about, and I would love to see you in another video.